The unseen hero. The blazing afternoon sun beat down on the narrow, cracked pavement where Carl walked, his footsteps slow and deliberate. At 13 years old, he had already learned to navigate the unkind streets of his small town with a mix of caution and determination. His worn sneakers kicked up dust with each step, his gaze scanning the ground for anything valuable: a discarded bottle, an aluminum can, or even a scrap of metal he could sell to the recycling center. In one hand, he clutched a plastic bag, already filled with a few cans he'd collected from his morning trek. The neighborhood gas station was his next stop. It was a busy place, the kind where people came and went in a rush, rarely sparing a glance for someone like Carl. But Carl liked it there. The constant movement gave him cover, letting him slip in and out without attracting too much attention. As he approached, he noticed Mr. Sterling, the station manager, standing near the pumps with a clipboard in hand. Sterling was a burly man with a perpetually grumpy demeanor. Carl tried to avoid him whenever possible, but today he wasn't quick enough. "Hey, kid." Sterling's voice boomed across the lot, making Carl wince. "I told you to stop hanging around here." Carl paused, gripping his bag tightly. "I'm just looking for cans," he said, his voice quiet but firm. Sterling scowled but waved him off. "Fine. Just make it quick." Carl nodded and moved toward the trash bins near the side of the station. His eyes darted around, scanning for anything useful. He worked quickly, his hands methodically sifting through wrappers and paper cups. The clinking sound of cans dropping into his bag gave him a strange sense of satisfaction. Each one was a step closer to the few dollars he and his mom desperately needed. Just as he was about to move to the next bin, a sleek black car pulled into the station. Its polished exterior gleamed under the sun, and Carl couldn't help but stare. The car was like nothing he'd ever seen in real life, only in magazines or on TV. It was the kind of car that belonged to people who lived in mansions and wore suits worth more than his mom made in a year. The driver stepped out, a man in his late 40s, dressed in a tailored suit that screamed wealth. He adjusted his cufflinks as he walked toward the convenience store, his confident stride drawing the attention of a few other customers. Carl tried to tear his eyes away, but something about the man held his focus. It wasn't just the man, though. Carl's gaze shifted back to the car, where he noticed a shadowy figure crouching by one of the rear tires. The figure moved quickly, their hands fumbling with something underneath the car. Carl squinted, his heart quickening as he realized what was happening. The figure was tampering with the car's brake lines. The man in the suit was still inside the store, oblivious to what was happening. Carl's mind raced. Should he say something? Would anyone even believe him? His hands trembled as he watched the figure finish their work and scurry away, disappearing around the corner of the building. He couldn't just stand there. Taking a deep breath, Carl dropped his bag of cans and stepped forward, his voice shaky but loud enough to carry. "Hey, sir, your car, something's wrong with it." The man in the suit stopped in his tracks, turning to face Carl with a confused expression. "What are you talking about?" he asked, his tone sharp. Carl pointed at the car, his words spilling out in a rush. "There was a guy. He messed with your brakes. I think he cut something." The man's face darkened, a mixture of disbelief and concern flashing across his features. He walked quickly to the car, crouching down to inspect it. Carl watched as the man's expression turned grim. After a moment, he stood and pulled out his phone, dialing with urgency. Carl felt a surge of relief when a police car arrived a few minutes later, lights flashing as it pulled into the lot. The man spoke to the officers, pointing in the direction the suspect had fled. One of the officers approached Carl, kneeling slightly to meet his eye level. "You saw someone tampering with the car?" the officer asked. Carl nodded, his voice steady despite the nerves buzzing in his chest. He described the figure in detail, the cap, the quick movements, the way they had darted away. The officer jotted down notes, nodding thoughtfully. "You did the right thing, kid," the officer said. "You might have just saved this man's life." The words hit Carl with a strange weight. He glanced at the man in the suit, who was now watching him with an unreadable expression. Carl felt his cheeks flush and looked down at the ground, suddenly unsure of himself. The man approached, his voice softer now. "What's your name, kid?" "Carl," he said, barely above a whisper. The man nodded, extending a hand. "I'm Mr. Jacobs, and I owe you more than I can say. Thank you." Carl hesitated for a moment before shaking the man's hand, his small, calloused fingers dwarfed by the firm grip of Mr. Jacobs. I just thought you should know," Carl said, shrugging. "Well, you did more than that," Mr. Jacobs said, his voice firm. "You acted when most people wouldn't. That's something to be proud of." Carl wasn't sure what to say. He nodded again, stepping back as the officers and Mr. Jacobs continued their discussion. He picked up his bag of cans, suddenly feeling out of place amidst the flashing lights and hushed voices. As he walked away, his heart still pounding, he couldn't shake the feeling that this moment was going to change something. He just didn't know how yet. A visitor at the door. The next morning, Carl woke up to the sound of his mom, Lisa, bustling around in the kitchen. The smell of weak coffee drifted through their tiny house. It wasn't much, but it was home. Carl stretched, rubbing his eyes before heading into the main room. The table was covered with bills again, a sight that made his stomach twist every time he saw it. Lisa looked up as he entered, her tired eyes softening with a smile. "Morning, sweetheart. Breakfast is on the stove." Carl glanced at the plate of toast and scrambled eggs. It wasn't a feast, but he knew his mom had probably skipped a meal the day before to make sure he had enough to eat. "Thanks, Mom," he said, grabbing the plate and sitting down. The silence between them was familiar but heavy, filled with the unspoken weight of their struggles. Carl wanted to tell her about what had happened at the gas station yesterday, but he hesitated. Would she understand, or would she just worry more? Before he could decide, there was a knock at the door. Carl and Lisa both froze. They didn't get visitors, certainly not at this time of day. Lisa wiped her hands on a dish towel, giving Carl a wary look before heading to the door. She peeked through the small window, her eyes widening in surprise. Carl heard her unlock the door and swing it open, her voice cautious. "Can I help you?" "Good morning," a deep, familiar voice replied. Carl's heart skipped a beat as he recognized it instantly. He jumped up, his plate forgotten, and moved to stand behind his mom. It was Mr. Jacobs, the man from the gas station. He stood on their worn porch, looking as out of place as a diamond in a junkyard. He was dressed casually today, but everything about him, from his polished shoes to his clean-shaven face, screamed wealth and importance. "Mrs. Lisa?" Mr. Jacobs asked, his tone polite but firm. "I'm sorry to show up unannounced, but I wanted to speak with you about your son." Lisa glanced back at Carl, her brows furrowed in confusion and concern. "Carl, what's going on? Did he do something wrong?" No, Mr. Jacobs said quickly, holding up his hands. "Quite the opposite. Actually, your son saved me from a potentially life-threatening situation yesterday." Lisa's eyes widened as she turned fully toward Carl. "What is he talking about?" Carl shuffled his feet, looking down. "I was at the gas station yesterday, and I saw someone messing with his car. I told him before he drove off." "You did what?" Lisa's voice rose, a mix of disbelief and worry. "Carl, why didn't you tell me?" "I didn't want you to worry," Carl said quietly, "but it was the right thing to do." Mr. Jacobs cleared his throat, drawing their attention back to him. "It was more than just the right thing. Your son's quick thinking might have saved my life." The police confirmed that the brakes were tampered with. If Carl hadn't said something, I might not be standing here today. Lisa pressed a hand to her chest, her face pale. "Oh my God. I wanted to thank you both," Mr. Jacobs continued. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small envelope, holding it out toward Lisa. "This is just a token of my gratitude." Lisa stared at the envelope like it was a snake about to bite her. "We don't take charity," she said firmly, crossing her arms. We get by just fine on our own." Carl's face burned with embarrassment. He knew his mom's pride came from a good place, but he also knew how much they needed help. "It's not charity," Mr. Jacobs said, his voice steady. "It's a thank you. Please, Mrs. Lisa, your son did something incredible, and I want to show my appreciation." Lisa hesitated, her gaze darting to Carl, who was staring at the ground. Finally, she sighed, her shoulders slumping. "All right," she said reluctantly, taking the envelope. "But we don't want anything else." "Understood," Mr. Jacobs said, his smile warm. He turned his attention to Carl. "And you, young man. I see a lot of potential in you. You've got courage, and that's rare these days. If you ever need anything at all, you call me." He pulled out a business card and handed it to Carl, who took it with wide eyes. "Thank you," Carl mumbled, clutching the card like it was made of gold. Mr. Jacobs nodded, then stepped back. "I won't keep you any longer, but I hope this small gesture helps. And Carl, keep being the remarkable young man you already are." With that, he turned and walked back to his car, leaving Lisa and Carl standing in stunned silence. They watched as the sleek black vehicle pulled away, its tires kicking up a cloud of dust on the gravel road. Lisa closed the door slowly, turning to Carl with a mixture of pride and worry in her eyes. "Why didn't you tell me about this yesterday?" "I didn't want you to worry," Carl repeated, his voice small. Lisa sighed, pulling him into a tight hug. "You did a brave thing, Carl. But you've got to let me in, okay? We're in this together." Carl nodded against her shoulder, feeling the weight of her words. When she finally pulled away, she opened the envelope, her eyes widening at the stack of crisp bills inside. This could cover the electric bill," she murmured, her voice trembling. Carl's heart swelled with a mix of relief and guilt. He wanted to help, but he also knew his mom's pride would always make accepting help a challenge. "Mom, maybe this is a good thing," he said softly. "We can use this to catch up. It doesn't mean we're weak." Lisa looked at him for a long moment, then nodded, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "Maybe you're right, Carl. Maybe it's time to let some good in." That night, Carl sat on his bed with his sketchbook, the weight of the day pressing down on him. He opened to a blank page and began to draw, letting his pencil move without thinking. He sketched a house, not the crumbling shack they lived in, but a home filled with light and warmth. A place where his mom didn't have to worry about bills, and where he didn't have to scour gas station trash cans for cans. It was just a dream. But for the first time in a long time, Carl felt like dreams were worth chasing. As Lisa counted the bills in the envelope, her hands trembled. Carl could tell she was conflicted, relieved by the unexpected help, but uneasy about accepting it. She set the money down on the table, smoothing the edges as if it might disappear. "Carl," she said softly, her voice carrying the weight of their struggles, "you did a good thing. But you have to understand. Accepting help from people like him, it feels like it comes with strings attached." Carl frowned, leaning forward. "Mr. Jacobs didn't seem like that kind of guy, Mom. He was nice, and it's not like we asked for this." Lisa sighed, rubbing her temples. "I know, honey. It's just, people like him, they don't usually look twice at folks like us. It's hard to trust that there's no catch." Carl opened his mouth to argue but stopped himself. He knew his mom had been through too much to believe in goodwill without reservations. He looked at the card Mr. Jacobs had given him, turning it over in his hands. It was simple, with just his name, a phone number, and an email address printed in bold, clean font. "Maybe not everyone's like that," Carl said, his voice steady. "He said I could call him if we ever needed anything. I think he really meant it." Lisa's gaze softened as she looked at her son, and she nodded slowly. "Maybe you're right. But we're not calling him unless it's a real emergency, you hear me?" Carl smiled faintly. "I hear you." Lisa picked up the envelope again, her fingers brushing the crisp bills. "We'll use this for the electric bill and some groceries," she said decisively. "And that's it. No luxuries, no extras." Carl nodded, his chest loosening a little. This money wouldn't solve all their problems, but it was a start. For the first time in months, it felt like the weight pressing down on their family might lift, just a little. The next day, Carl returned to his usual routine. With his plastic bag slung over his shoulder, he walked the dusty roads toward the recycling center. The heat was just as relentless as the day before, but this time, Carl felt lighter. He didn't know why exactly. Maybe it was the money, or maybe it was Mr. Jacob's words, which still echoed in his head. "You've got courage." And that's rare these days. When he reached the gas station, Carl hesitated. He hadn't planned to stop there today, but something pulled him toward it. He glanced around as he approached, his eyes scanning the lot. The memory of the man tampering with Mr. Jacob's car sent a chill down his spine. What if he came back? Mr. Sterling was standing near the pumps again, wiping his hands on a grease-stained rag. He gave Carl a brief glance but didn't say anything. Carl was grateful for the silence. He walked past the trash bins, his eyes darting to where the black car had been parked the day before. The ground was still marked with the faint outline of tire tracks. As he lingered, Carl noticed a patrol car parked at the edge of the lot. One of the officers he'd spoken to yesterday was inside, leaning back in his seat and sipping from a paper cup. Carl's stomach twisted with a mix of pride and unease. He'd done the right thing, but it still felt strange to be involved in something so serious. The officer noticed Carl and gave him a small nod. Carl nodded back, feeling a flicker of something he couldn't quite name. Respect, maybe, or acknowledgement. By the time Carl got home that afternoon, his bag was heavier than usual, filled with cans and bottles he collected along the way. Lisa was in the kitchen, sorting through a modest haul of groceries she picked up with the money from Mr. Jacobs. "How'd it go?" she asked without looking up. Carl shrugged, setting the bag down by the door. "Same as always. But I saw one of the cops from yesterday at the gas station." Lisa paused, her hand stilling over a loaf of bread. "Everything okay?" "Yeah," Carl said quickly. He just nodded at me. "I think they're keeping an eye on the place." Lisa sighed, relief evident in her posture. "Good. I don't want you getting caught up in anything dangerous, Carl." "I won't," Carl promised, though part of him felt uneasy. The image of the man in the cap tampering with the car lingered in his mind. Who was he? Why had he done it? And what would have happened if Carl hadn't spoken up? Later that evening, Carl retreated to his room, pulling out his sketchbook. The edges were frayed, and some of the pages had smudges from his pencil, but it was one of his most prized possessions. He flipped to a blank page and began to draw. The lines came naturally, almost without thought. He sketched a house, his dream house. It was nothing like the tiny, rundown home he and Lisa lived in. This house had smooth walls, big windows, and a wraparound porch. There was a garden in the front yard, filled with flowers of every color. As he worked, Carl imagined what it would be like to live in a house like this. No leaky roof, no peeling paint, no constant worry about bills. Just him and his mom, safe and happy. For the first time in a long time, Carl let himself hope. Maybe, just maybe, they could find a way to make it through. Maybe things really could get better. He put the finishing touches on the drawing, his pencil tracing the lines of the porch one last time. Then he closed the sketchbook, setting it on the small nightstand by his mattress. Curling up under his threadbare blanket, Carl let his eyes drift shut, a faint smile on his face. For the first time in months, he dreamed of a future that didn't feel so far away. The turning point. Carl woke the next morning to the gentle hum of life stirring in their small home. His mom was already up, bustling around the kitchen as the smell of frying eggs wafted through the air. The sunlight streaming through the cracked window cast long rays across the room, warming the worn floorboards. It was one of those rare mornings when the weight of their struggles didn't feel quite so suffocating. The envelope from Mr. Jacobs still sat in the middle of the table, the edges neatly tucked under a coffee mug. Lisa had paid the electric bill the day before, and the flickering lights had been replaced with a steady, comforting glow. Carl rubbed the sleep from his eyes and shuffled into the kitchen. His mom turned, giving him a small but genuine smile. "Morning, Carl. Breakfast is almost ready. Eat up before you head out." "Thanks, Mom," Carl said, sitting down at the table. He glanced at the sketchbook he'd left there the night before, his fingers itching to add more details to the house he'd drawn. But before he could pick up his pencil, there was a sharp knock at the door. Lisa froze, her spatula hovering over the pan. They both turned toward the sound, their eyes meeting briefly. Visitors were a rarity in their world, and an unexpected knock usually meant trouble. "I'll get it," Lisa said, wiping her hands on a dish towel as she moved toward the door. Carl followed a few steps behind, his curiosity outweighing his nerves. When Lisa opened the door, a middle-aged woman with sharp features and a clipboard stood on the porch. She wore a navy blue blazer, and her hair was pulled back into a tight bun. Behind her was a man in a crisp uniform, another police officer. Carl's heart skipped a beat as he recognized the officer from the gas station. "Good morning," the woman said briskly, glancing down at her clipboard. "Mrs. Lisa, I presume?" Lisa nodded, her grip tightening on the doorframe. "Yes, that's me. What's this about?" The woman's gaze flicked to Carl, then back to Lisa. "My name is Detective Harper. I'm here following up on the incident involving your son and Mr. Jacobs' vehicle." Lisa's face hardened slightly. "Has something happened?" Carl already told the officers everything he saw. Detective Harper smiled faintly, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Yes," and his statement was incredibly helpful. "In fact, that's why we're here." She glanced at Carl again, her tone softening. "Carl, do you mind if we talk for a few minutes? You're not in trouble. We just have a few more questions." Carl swallowed hard but nodded. "Okay." Lisa stepped aside, letting the detective and the officer into their small home. They seemed to take in every detail: the peeling wallpaper, the mismatched furniture, the faint hum of the fridge in the corner. Carl sat down at the kitchen table, his mom taking the seat beside him. The officer leaned against the wall, while Detective Harper pulled out a small notebook and pen. "Carl," she began, her tone gentle but probing, "I want to start by saying you did a brave thing. Not everyone would have spoken up the way you did. You might have saved Mr. Jacobs' life." Carl felt his cheeks flush. He nodded, unsure of how to respond. "Now, I need you to think carefully," she continued. "When you saw the man tampering with the car, did you notice anything distinctive about him? Any tattoos, scars, or unusual features?" Carl frowned, thinking back to that moment. The memory was sharp, like a snapshot burned into his mind. "He had a cap pulled down low," he said slowly, "and he moved fast, like he didn't want anyone to see him. I couldn't see his face that well, but I think he had a scar. Right here." He pointed to the side of his jaw. Detective Harper nodded, jotting this down. "That's helpful, Carl. Anything else? Did he say anything, or did you hear anything unusual while he was there?" Carl shook his head. "No, he didn't say anything, but he kept looking around, like he was making sure no one was watching. When he saw me, he froze for a second before he ran off." The detective exchanged a glance with the officer, who gave a slight nod. "You've given us a lot to work with, Carl. Thank you." She paused, her gaze softening. "I want you to know that the man you saw is someone we've been tracking for a while. He's involved in some dangerous activities, and your statement could help us stop him." Lisa's hand tightened on Carl's shoulder. "Dangerous? What do you mean, dangerous?" Detective Harper hesitated, then said carefully, "We believe the man was hired to sabotage Mr. Jacobs' car. It wasn't a random act. It was targeted. Mr. Jacobs has been involved in some high-profile business dealings, and this may have been an attempt to intimidate him or worse." Carl's stomach turned. "So, that guy wanted to hurt Mr. Jacobs. On purpose. "That's what we believe," the detective said. "But thanks to you, he didn't succeed. You did a very brave thing, Carl." The words should have felt like a compliment, but instead they made Carl's chest tighten. He thought of the man's sharp movements, the way his eyes had locked onto Carl before disappearing around the corner. What if the man came back? What if he figured out who Carl was? As if sensing his fear, Detective Harper leaned forward slightly. "Carl, we're doing everything we can to find this man. You don't need to worry. We'll keep you and your mom safe." Lisa didn't look reassured. Her lips pressed into a thin line, and her eyes darted to the window as if expecting the man to be there, watching. "I don't want him getting caught up in any more of this," she said firmly. "He's just a kid." "I understand," the detective said, her voice calm. "But Carl's actions have already made a difference. We'll be keeping an eye on your neighborhood, and if anything seems out of place, don't hesitate to call us." She handed Lisa a business card, then stood. "Thank you for your time. We'll be in touch." The officer followed her out, leaving Carl and Lisa sitting in tense silence. When the door closed, Lisa let out a shaky breath and turned to her son. "You okay?" she asked, brushing a hand over his hair. Carl nodded, though his stomach still churned. "Yeah, but Mom, do you think he'll come back?" "That guy?" Lisa hesitated, then shook her head. "No, Carl. The police are on it. We'll be fine." But Carl could see the doubt in her eyes, and it mirrored his own. As much as he wanted to believe her, a part of him couldn't shake the feeling that the man in the cap wasn't done yet. That night, as Carl lay in bed staring at the ceiling, he thought about what Detective Harper had said. "Your statement could help us stop him." The words swirled in his mind, mingling with the fear and pride he felt. He glanced at his sketchbook on the nightstand and reached for it, flipping to the page with the house he'd drawn. The house represented hope, a future where he and his mom didn't have to live in fear. Carl traced the lines of the drawing with his finger, his jaw tightening with determination. If there was one thing he'd learned, it was that standing up for what was right wasn't easy, but sometimes it was the only way to build a better future. The next few days passed in a strange, tense quiet. Carl and Lisa tried to go about their routines, but the weight of the detective's visit lingered. Every creak of the house and shadow outside the window made Lisa flinch, and Carl found himself glancing over his shoulder more often than usual. But life didn't stop. Bills still needed to be paid, and groceries had to be bought. Lisa poured herself into her work, picking up extra cleaning jobs where she could, while Carl kept up his daily trek for recyclables. The envelope from Mr. Jacobs had given them a bit of breathing room, but it wouldn't last forever. Carl knew that as much as his mom hated taking help, they'd need another solution soon. One afternoon, Carl returned home from the recycling center, his bag lighter than he'd hoped. The usual hum of life in their small neighborhood, kids shouting, dogs barking, the occasional distant rumble of a truck, felt muted. As he approached the house, he noticed something unusual, a sleek black car parked in front of their gate. His heart sank. It was Mr. Jacobs' car. Carl quickened his pace, his mind racing. Why was Mr. Jacobs here? Had something happened? He opened the gate carefully, the rusty hinges squealing in protest, and stepped into the yard. Through the front window, he saw Mr. Jacobs sitting at their kitchen table, a cup of coffee in front of him. Carl burst through the door, his voice louder than he intended. "What's going on?" Lisa, who was standing by the counter, turned sharply. "Carl, don't slam the door like that." Her expression was a mixture of irritation and concern. "Mr. Jacobs came to check on us. Sit down." Mr. Jacobs smiled warmly, though Carl could see a faint tension in his eyes. "Hello, Carl. I hope I'm not intruding. I just wanted to see how you and your mom were doing." Carl hesitated, then sat across from him at the table. We're okay," he said cautiously. "Why?" Mr. Jacobs leaned forward slightly, his hands clasped together. "I heard from the detective that you gave them more details about the man who tampered with my car." That took courage, Carl. I wanted to thank you again. Carl shrugged, avoiding his gaze. It wasn't a big deal. It was a big deal, Mr. Jacobs said firmly. Not just for me, but for the police investigation. You might have given them the break they needed to catch this guy. Lisa cleared her throat, her arms crossed tightly. Mr. Jacobs, we appreciate everything you've done, but I don't want Carl getting any more involved in this. He's just a kid. I understand, Mr. Jacobs said, his tone serious. I promise, I'm not here to push him into anything. But I do want to help. Lisa's jaw tightened. We don't need charity. Carl winced at the sharpness in her voice, but Mr. Jacobs didn't seem offended. Instead, he nodded, as if he'd expected it. I admire your pride, Mrs. Lisa, but what I'm offering isn't charity, it's opportunity. Both Carl and Lisa stared at him, confused. Mr. Jacobs reached into his bag and pulled out a folder, placing it on the table. I run a business, a large one. And with that comes resources. One of those resources is a scholarship program for kids who show promise and determination. Carl, you remind me of someone I knew when I was younger. Someone who didn't have much but worked hard for everything he got. I'd like to nominate you for the program. Carl's mouth fell open. A scholarship. Yes, Mr. Jacobs said, smiling. The program provides funding for education, mentorship opportunities, and even resources for developing skills. I saw your drawings at the gas station that day, Carl. You have talent. With the right guidance, you could turn that talent into something extraordinary. Carl felt a lump form in his throat. He looked at his mom, whose face was unreadable. Mom, he asked, his voice shaky. Lisa stared at the folder for a long moment before meeting Mr. Jacobs' gaze. What's the catch? There's no catch, Mr. Jacobs said simply. The program's purpose is to invest in potential. All I ask is that Carl continues to work hard and take this opportunity seriously. Lisa's lips pressed into a thin line. Carl could see the conflict in her eyes, pride battling against practicality. Finally, she let out a long breath and looked at Carl. What do you think, honey? This is your decision. Carl swallowed hard, his heart pounding. He thought of his sketchbook, of the house he'd drawn again and again. He thought of the future he wanted, not just for himself, but for his mom. A future where they didn't have to struggle every day. I want to do it, he said, his voice steady. I'll work hard, Mom. I promise. Lisa's eyes softened, and she reached out to squeeze his hand. Okay, Carl. If this is what you want, we'll make it work. Mr. Jacobs smiled, a hint of pride in his expression. Good choice, Carl. I'll have my assistant send over the paperwork. And don't worry, I'll be here to guide you through every step of the process. That night, Carl sat under the old oak tree in their backyard, his sketchbook open on his lap. The moon cast a silvery glow over the pages as he sketched, his pencil moving with newfound purpose. For the first time, his dream of becoming an architect didn't feel so far away. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing. He was ready to fight for it. With people like his mom and Mr. Jacobs in his corner, anything felt possible. Building dreams. The following days were a whirlwind of change. Carl wasn't used to having anything resembling opportunity fall into his lap, and it all felt a little surreal. Mr. Jacobs had sent over a packet of forms for the scholarship program. Carl and his mom spent hours poring over the details at their creaky kitchen table, their heads bent over the paperwork. Lisa read each section with care, occasionally biting her lip as she worked through the terms. She'd always been cautious, especially when it came to promises that sounded too good to be true. But the more they read, the more it became clear this wasn't a handout. It was an investment. This is really happening, Carl murmured as he looked over one section describing mentorship opportunities. Mom, they even offer classes on design software. I could actually learn how to use the stuff architects use. Lisa glanced up from the form she was reading, her expression softening. It looks like a good program, Carl. But remember, this won't be easy. You'll have to work harder than you ever have before." Carl nodded, the weight of her words settling over him. "I know. But I want to do this. I'll make it work." Lisa gave him a small, proud smile. "I know you will." When the paperwork was finally submitted, Carl's life started to shift in ways he hadn't imagined. The first big change came in the form of Mr. Jacobs' assistant, a young woman named Elaine, who showed up at their house one morning with a laptop. "This is for you," she said, handing Carl the sleek device. "The program includes tools to help participants succeed, and this is one of them. It's preloaded with design software, educational materials, and access to virtual mentorship sessions." Carl stared at the laptop in awe. He'd never owned anything remotely this expensive or advanced. I don't know what to say." "Just say you'll use it well," Elaine said with a kind smile. "You've earned this opportunity, Carl." The next few weeks were some of the busiest of Carl's life. He threw himself into the scholarship program, attending virtual workshops and mentorship sessions after school. The first time he opened the design software, it felt like stepping into another world. The blank screen was intimidating at first, but as he began to experiment with shapes, lines, and textures, he realized it wasn't so different from his sketchbook, just more powerful. One of his mentors, a soft-spoken architect named Mr. Turner, was especially encouraging. During their weekly video calls, he would guide Carl through exercises, offering tips and insights. "You've got a natural eye for structure," Mr. Turner said during one session. "Your sketches show a strong sense of proportion, which is rare for someone your age. Keep refining that, and you'll go far." Hearing those words made Carl's chest swell with pride. For the first time, he felt like his dream of becoming an architect wasn't just a fantasy. It was a real, tangible goal. Meanwhile, Lisa noticed a change in Carl. He was more focused, more determined. Every spare moment was spent at the kitchen table or under the oak tree, sketching ideas or practicing with the software. Even his demeanor seemed lighter, as though the weight of their struggles didn't press as heavily on his shoulders anymore. One evening, as Carl was finishing up a design, Lisa brought him a cup of tea and sat down beside him. "You've been working so hard," she said softly, glancing at the intricate drawing on his screen. "I'm proud of you, Carl." Carl looked up, his face glowing with quiet determination. "Thanks, Mom. I want to make something of myself. For both of us." Lisa's eyes grew misty, but she smiled. "You already are." But not everything about this new chapter was easy. Toby, the boy who had taunted Carl about being a hero, hadn't forgotten their last encounter. At school, he found new ways to needle Carl. "Look at Mr. Big Shot," Toby sneered one day as Carl walked into the classroom. "Got yourself a fancy laptop and everything. What's next?" "A mansion." Carl clenched his jaw but kept walking, refusing to rise to the bait. Toby's words stung, but they didn't have the same power they used to. Carl had something to focus on now, something bigger than petty insults. Still, the bullying escalated. Toby spread rumors about Carl, mocking his involvement with the police and making it seem like Carl had only helped Mr. Jacobs for the money. Some of the other kids joined in, and for a while, Carl felt like he was back to being the invisible kid who didn't belong. But this time, he refused to let it crush him. One afternoon, after a particularly rough day at school, Carl headed to the community center. Miss Anna, the drawing instructor, had become one of his biggest supporters, and the center felt like a safe space. He walked in, the cool air a welcome contrast to the heat outside, and sat down at his usual spot with his sketchbook. Miss Anna came over, her kind eyes full of concern. "You look like you've had a rough day, Carl. Want to talk about it?" Carl hesitated, then nodded. "It's just the kids at school. They think I'm doing all this for the wrong reasons. They don't get it." Miss Anna sat down beside him, her voice gentle. "You know, Carl, people often criticize what they don't understand, but their opinions don't define you. What matters is what you're doing and why you're doing it. Carl nodded, her words sinking in. "Thanks, Miss Anna. I'll keep that in mind." The breakthrough came 2 weeks later. Carl was working on a design for the scholarship program's midterm evaluation. The assignment was to create a model for a community space that prioritized sustainability and accessibility. Carl had spent days researching and sketching, trying to incorporate features like solar panels and wheelchair ramps. When he presented his design to the scholarship committee via video call, their reaction was overwhelming. "This is exceptional, Carl," one of the panelists said, her voice filled with genuine admiration. "You've demonstrated not only creativity, but also a deep understanding of the practical needs of a community. Keep this up, and you'll have a bright future ahead." Carl felt a swell of pride as he closed his laptop after the call. He turned to his mom, who had been standing quietly in the corner, and grinned. "Mom, they liked it. They'd really liked it." Lisa pulled him into a hug, her eyes shining. "Of course they did, Carl. You're amazing." For the first time in his life, Carl believed her. That evening, as Carl sat under the oak tree with his sketchbook, he realized how far he'd come. The house he'd drawn so many times was still his dream. But now it felt more achievable than ever. He could picture it clearly. Each window, each brick, each beam of sunlight streaming through the big open spaces. He didn't know exactly where this journey would take him, but he knew one thing for sure. He was building something bigger than himself. Something strong, something lasting. He was building a future, and for the first time, that future didn't seem so far away. The following week, Carl found himself juggling his growing responsibilities. His scholarship program was ramping up with more assignments, design challenges, and mentorship sessions. At the same time, he tried to keep up with schoolwork and help his mom around the house. It was exhausting, but it felt good. A different kind of exhaustion from the days when he wandered aimlessly, searching for cans to make a few dollars. One evening, as he worked on a new design project for the scholarship program, Lisa sat beside him at the kitchen table, sorting through bills. The stress on her face was familiar, but it wasn't as sharp as before. The stability from the scholarship and her steady work had brought a sense of relief, even if only temporary. Carl was focused on sketching a design for a library space. The challenge was to incorporate natural elements into the structure. His pencil moved fluidly across the paper as he imagined sunlight streaming through large open windows and trees lining the walls inside and out. He glanced at the laptop screen, where he'd been researching biophilic design principles, something Mr. Turner, his mentor, had suggested. "You've been at that for hours," Lisa said, looking up from her papers. "Don't you need a break?" Carl shook his head, his eyes still on the sketch. "I'm almost done with this part. I just need to figure out how to make the roof work with the natural light." Lisa chuckled softly. "You sound like a real architect already." Carl smiled but didn't look up. "Not yet, but I'm getting there." A few days later, Carl received an email from the scholarship program coordinator. It was an invitation to a local design showcase where participants could present their work to industry professionals and community leaders. Carl's stomach flipped as he read the details. "Mom," he called, rushing into the living room where Lisa was folding laundry. "They want me to go to a design showcase. It's a big event. Like, really big. I'd have to present my work in front of people." Lisa's eyes widened as she put down the shirt she was holding. "Carl, that's incredible. What an opportunity." She paused, her expression turning thoughtful. "But are you okay with it? Talking in front of a crowd isn't easy." Carl hesitated, the excitement giving way to nerves. "I don't know. I mean, I want to do it. But what if I mess up? What if they think my designs are stupid?" Lisa stood and placed her hands on his shoulders, looking him in the eye. "Listen to me, Carl. You've worked hard for this. You've earned it. And even if you're nervous, remember that no one can take away what you've accomplished. Just be yourself. That's enough." Carl took a deep breath, nodding. "Okay, I'll do it." The weeks leading up to the showcase were a blur of preparation. Carl refined his designs with help from Mr. Turner, who encouraged him to focus on storytelling. Architecture isn't just about buildings, Mr. Turner explained during one of their calls. It's about the lives those buildings will touch. When you present your designs, tell the story of what they mean to you and the people who will use them. Carl took those words to heart. He spent hours practicing his presentation, imagining the audience and how he would explain his ideas. He even rehearsed in front of Lisa, who clapped enthusiastically after every run-through. "You're going to knock their socks off," she said with a proud grin. The day of the showcase arrived, and Carl could hardly sit still on the ride to the event. Mr. Jacobs had arranged transportation, sending a car to pick up Carl and Lisa. As they pulled up to the venue, a sleek, modern building with glass walls and a buzzing crowd, Carl's palms began to sweat. "Ready?" Lisa asked, giving his hand a reassuring squeeze. Carl nodded, though his heart was pounding. "Yeah, let's do this." Inside, the space was filled with booths where participants had set up their designs. Carl found his assigned spot and carefully set up his materials. Printed sketches, digital renderings on his laptop, and a small model he painstakingly crafted out of cardboard. As the event began, people started walking through, stopping at each booth to ask questions and admire the designs. Carl's nerves spiked when he saw the first group of visitors heading his way. A middle-aged man in a tailored suit, a woman with a clipboard, and a young girl who looked to be a fellow participant. "Hello," the man said, offering a warm smile. "I'm Richard. Tell us about your project." Carl took a deep breath and launched into his presentation. "This is a design for a community library that incorporates natural elements to create a calming, welcoming space. The large windows allow for natural light, reducing the need for artificial lighting, and the indoor trees provide a connection to nature." As he spoke, his confidence grew. The group asked thoughtful questions, and Carl found himself answering with ease, even enjoying the conversation. When they moved on, he let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "That was amazing," Lisa whispered, giving him a thumbs up from behind the booth. Throughout the day, Carl presented his work to dozens of people. Some were architects, others were community leaders, and a few were students like him. By the end of the event, he felt a mixture of exhaustion and pride. He'd done it. He'd faced his fears and shared his vision. As the crowd began to thin, Carl noticed Mr. Jacobs approaching his booth. The man's warm smile and confident stride made Carl's shoulders relax. "How's it going, Carl?" Mr. Jacobs asked, glancing over the display. "It's been great," Carl said, his excitement bubbling over. "People really seem to like my design." Mr. Jacobs nodded, his expression thoughtful as he studied the sketches and model. "You've come a long way since the day of the gas station. I'm proud of you." Carl felt his cheeks flush. "Thank you. I wouldn't be here without your help." Mr. Jacobs placed a hand on Carl's shoulder. "You earned this, Carl. Don't ever forget that." That evening, as Carl and Lisa returned home, the weight of the day's events settled over them. Lisa was beaming, her pride evident in the way she couldn't stop talking about how well Carl had done. "You were incredible," she said for the 10th time as they walked into the house. "I can't wait to see where this takes you." Carl smiled, though his mind was already racing with ideas for his next project. He sat down at the kitchen table, opened his sketchbook, and began drawing. This time, it wasn't just a dream house. It was a vision of something bigger, a future filled with possibilities he'd only begun to imagine. For the first time, Carl truly believed that the life he and his mom had dreamed of was within reach, and he was ready to keep building, one line, one idea, one step at a time. Unseen challenges. In the weeks following the design showcase, Carl's world continued to expand in ways he never thought possible. He received an email from one of the judges, offering to connect him with a local architect who specialized in sustainable community projects. The connection felt surreal, as if he'd been thrust into a world he had only dreamed about. But alongside the opportunities came challenges, ones that tested Carl's resolve and made him question if he could truly navigate this new path. One of the biggest hurdles was balancing his newfound responsibilities with his life at home and school. The scholarship program required hours of work each week, from completing design challenges to attending virtual mentorship sessions. On top of that, schoolwork had become more demanding, with final exams approaching. Carl found himself staying up late most nights, his desk lit by a small lamp as he juggled geometry problems, design sketches, and scholarship assignments. He often heard his mom's voice in the background, speaking softly on the phone as she coordinated her cleaning jobs. It was a constant reminder of why he was pushing himself so hard. One night, as Carl stared at his laptop, trying to finish a model for a public park design, Lisa appeared in the doorway. She leaned against the frame, her face etched with concern. "You've been at that for hours," she said, crossing her arms. "Don't you think it's time for a break?" "I can't, Mom," Carl replied, not looking up. "The deadline's tomorrow, and I'm nowhere near done." Lisa walked over, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Carl, you're going to burn yourself out. You need to rest." Carl sighed, closing his laptop with a quiet click. "I just don't want to mess this up, Mom. This scholarship, it's my chance to make something of myself. For us." Lisa knelt beside him, her eyes soft. "Honey, I'm proud of you no matter what. But you have to take care of yourself too. You can't build something strong if you're falling apart." Her words lingered in Carl's mind as he went to bed that night. He promised himself he'd find a better balance, but it was easier said than done. At school, things weren't any easier. Toby and his group had grown bolder, their taunts escalating now that Carl's achievements were becoming more visible. "Hey, hero," Toby called one day in the hallway, his voice dripping with mockery. "What's next?" "Gonna design a mansion for Mr. Jacobs." Carl ignored him, keeping his head down as he made his way to class. But the words stung more than he wanted to admit. He hated how Toby twisted his hard work into something selfish, as if Carl were only chasing success to show off. The final straw came one afternoon when Carl opened his locker to find his sketchbook missing. Panic surged through him as he frantically searched the surrounding area, but it was nowhere to be found. "Looking for this?" Toby's voice came from behind him. Carl turned to see Toby holding the sketchbook, a smirk on his face. He flipped through the pages carelessly, as if they meant nothing. "Give it back," Carl said, his voice low and steady. "Relax," Toby said, laughing. "What's the big deal? Just wanted to see what the big fuss is about. All these houses, you think anyone's actually gonna live in one of these?" Carl stepped forward, his fists clenched. "I said, give it back." For a moment, Carl thought Toby would push him further, but something in Carl's eyes must have given him pause. With a scoff, Toby tossed the sketchbook onto the floor. "Whatever. Don't get your hopes up, Carl. People like us don't get to dream big." Carl knelt to pick up the sketchbook, his hands trembling. As Toby walked away, Carl felt a mix of anger and sadness. People like us. The words echoed in his mind. Was that really how Toby saw the world? That evening, as Carl sat under the oak tree in his backyard, he opened the sketchbook and stared at the pages. Most of the designs were intact, but one page had a tear where Toby had flipped too roughly. It hurt to see his work treated so carelessly, but it also fueled his determination. People like us. Carl's jaw tightened. He wasn't going to let those words define him. He would prove Toby, and anyone who doubted him, wrong. The next morning, Carl received a surprise email from Mr. Turner, his mentor. The subject line read, "Exciting opportunity. Are you ready?" Carl clicked it open, his heart racing as he read the message. The scholarship program was hosting a regional competition for its participants. The challenge: to design a multifunctional community center that addressed both social and environmental needs. The winner would receive additional funding for their education and a chance to intern with a leading architecture firm. Carl's eyes widened as he read the details. It was the kind of opportunity that could change everything. But it also came with high stakes. The judges would include renowned architects and community leaders, people whose opinions could shape Carl's future. That evening, Carl sat with Lisa to discuss the competition. "It sounds amazing," Lisa said, her voice filled with awe. "But are you sure you want to take this on? You're already balancing so much." "I want to do it," Carl said firmly. "I know it's a lot, but I can handle it. And this could open doors I never thought I'd have." Lisa studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "Okay, Carl, I believe in you." The competition pushed Carl harder than anything he'd ever faced. He spent weeks researching, sketching, and refining his design. He envisioned a community center that could serve as a safe haven for families, a learning hub for students, and a gathering place for the entire neighborhood. Solar panels lined the roof, and rainwater collection systems provided sustainable irrigation for a rooftop garden. Mr. Turner offered guidance along the way, helping Carl navigate the technical aspects of the design. "Remember, Carl," he said during one session, "this isn't just about how the building looks. It's about how it feels, how it serves the people who use it." Carl took those words to heart. He thought about his own community and the struggles his family faced. He imagined a space where people like Lisa could find support, where kids like him could discover their potential. Every line he drew carried that vision. On the day of the competition, Carl stood in front of the judges with his heart pounding. His model sat on the table beside him, a physical representation of weeks of hard work. As he began his presentation, he focused on the story he wanted to tell, the story of a boy who dreamed of building something better, not just for himself, but for everyone around him. When he finished, there was a moment of silence. Then one of the judges, a distinguished architect with salt and pepper hair, spoke. "Your design is remarkable, Carl," he said. "It's thoughtful, innovative, and deeply personal. You have a gift, not just for architecture, but for understanding the heart of what communities need." Carl's chest swelled with pride as the judges applauded. He glanced at Lisa, who was standing in the back of the room, her eyes shining with tears. That evening, as Carl and Lisa walked home, the weight of the day's events settled over them. The competition had been an overwhelming experience, but it had reaffirmed Carl's belief in his path. "You were incredible," Lisa said, squeezing his hand. "I always knew you were special, but today, you showed the world what you're capable of." Carl smiled, his heart light. "Thanks, Mom. I couldn't have done it without you." As they reached their house, Carl looked up at the old weathered structure. It wasn't much, but it was theirs. And now, he saw it as more than a place of struggle. It was the foundation of the dreams he was building, one design at a time. Carl's success at the regional competition didn't mean things became easier. In many ways, the stakes grew even higher. Winning the judges' admiration had opened doors, but it also put a spotlight on Carl that he wasn't entirely prepared for. The next day, the scholarship program sent out a newsletter highlighting the competition winners. Carl's name and design were featured prominently, alongside a photo of him standing next to his model. While Carl felt an immense sense of pride, the attention also brought new challenges he hadn't anticipated. At school, the reactions to Carl's win were mixed. Some of his classmates congratulated him sincerely, but others, led by Toby, used it as fuel for their taunts. "Big deal," Toby said loudly during lunch, his voice carrying across the cafeteria. "So he drew some buildings. What's he going to do when it all falls apart? You think people like us can just climb out of this? He's dreaming." Carl clenched his fists under the table, the words striking a nerve. He wanted to stand up and tell Toby he was wrong, that he wasn't just dreaming. He was building something real. But he remembered his mom's advice. "Don't let them drag you down. Keep your head up." Instead of reacting, Carl pulled out his notebook and began sketching. His pencil moved furiously across the page, turning his frustration into something constructive. He imagined a space where kids like Toby wouldn't feel trapped. A youth center with art studios, sports facilities, and classrooms for mentorship programs. He let the vision take shape, blocking out the noise around him. That evening, Carl shared the design with Lisa. She was sitting at the kitchen table, folding laundry while Carl worked on his sketch. When he turned the notebook around to show her, her eyes widened. "Is this something you're working on for the scholarship?" she asked. "No," Carl said, shaking his head. "It's just an idea I had. A place where kids can feel like they have options, where they can see there's more to life than what's right in front of them." Lisa's expression softened, and she reached out to touch his hand. "You've got a good heart, Carl. I think this could be something amazing one day." Carl smiled, but a flicker of doubt lingered in his chest. Amazing was one thing, possible was another. Could he really bring these ideas to life? The next major challenge came in the form of an internship opportunity through the scholarship program. Carl received an email from Mr. Turner inviting him to apply for a summer position with a prestigious architecture firm in the city. The internship would be unpaid, but it offered invaluable experience and mentorship from some of the best architects in the field. Carl's excitement was immediate, until he started thinking about the logistics. The firm was located more than an hour away, and transportation costs alone would strain their already tight budget. On top of that, the unpaid nature of the internship meant Carl couldn't contribute financially during the summer, something he had hoped to do. That night, he sat with Lisa to discuss the opportunity. She listened carefully as Carl explained the details, her face a mixture of pride and concern. "It sounds like an incredible opportunity," she said slowly. "But can we afford it? I mean, between the travel and everything else." Carl's heart sank. He had known this would be an issue, but hearing it out loud made it feel more real. "I can figure something out," he said quickly. "Maybe I can get a part-time job on the weekends to help cover the costs." Lisa shook her head, her lips pressing into a thin line. "Carl, you're already doing so much. I don't want you to burn out." "But Mom," Carl protested, "this could be my way in. If I can make connections at this firm, it might lead to a paid position later. I can't just pass this up." Lisa looked at him for a long moment, then sighed. "Let me think about it. Maybe there's a way we can make it work." The next day, Carl decided to ask for advice from Mr. Turner during their mentorship session. He explained the situation, his voice tinged with frustration and worry. Mr. Turner listened intently, nodding as Carl spoke. When Carl finished, he leaned back in his chair, a thoughtful expression on his face. "Carl, I understand how challenging this must feel," he said. "But opportunities like this don't come around often. If transportation costs are the main issue, have you considered reaching out to Mr. Jacobs? He's been a strong supporter of yours. He might be willing to help." Carl hesitated. The idea of asking Mr. Jacobs for help felt like crossing a line. "I don't want to seem like I'm taking advantage of him," he admitted. Mr. Turner smiled gently. "You're not taking advantage, Carl. Mr. Jacobs believes in you, and I'm sure he'd want to support you in pursuing this opportunity. Sometimes, building something great means accepting help along the way." The next morning, Carl mustered the courage to call Mr. Jacobs. His hands were clammy as he dialed the number, and his heart raced when Mr. Jacobs picked up. "Hello, Carl." Mr. Jacobs' warm voice greeted him. "It's good to hear from you. How's everything going?" Carl took a deep breath. "Hi, Mr. Jacobs. Things are going well, but I wanted to ask for some advice, and maybe some help." He explained the internship situation, trying to keep his voice steady. When he finished, there was a brief pause on the other end of the line. "Carl, I'm so glad you told me about this," Mr. Jacobs said finally. "Of course I'll help. I can arrange for a monthly travel stipend to cover your transportation, and if there are any other expenses, don't hesitate to let me know." Carl felt a rush of relief and gratitude. "Thank you, Mr. Jacobs. I don't know what to say. Just promise me one thing," Mr. Jacobs said with a chuckle. "Make the most of this opportunity. I believe in you, Carl, and I know you're going to do great things." With Mr. Jacobs' support, Carl accepted the internship and began preparing for the summer ahead. It was a turning point, a chance to step further into the world he dreamed of, even if it came with challenges. Every late night, every moment of doubt, and every sacrifice felt worth it as he imagined the possibilities that lay ahead. Carl's journey was far from over, but he was ready to face whatever came next. He wasn't just dreaming anymore. He was building a future, one brick at a time. The foundation of a future. Summer arrived in a blaze of heat, marking the start of Carl's internship at the prestigious architecture firm. On his first day, he sat in the back seat of the car Mr. Jacobs had arranged for him, clutching his sketchbook and a bag packed with essentials. The city skyline grew larger with every passing mile, a sea of towering glass and steel that both thrilled and intimidated him. When Carl arrived at the firm, he stood in awe of the sleek, modern building. Its reflective windows reached into the sky, mirroring the bustling streets below. The lobby was equally impressive: marble floors, abstract art, and professionals in tailored suits moving with purpose. "Can I help you?" a receptionist asked, her voice polite but efficient. "I'm Carl Winters," he said, his voice steady despite his nerves. "I'm here for the summer internship program." The receptionist smiled and directed him to a small conference room where the other interns were gathered. Carl walked in, feeling a knot in his stomach as he scanned the room. Most of the other interns were older, college students with polished portfolios and confident demeanors. Carl's worn backpack and nervous smile made him feel out of place, but he reminded himself why he was here. He'd earned this. The internship began with an introduction from the firm's senior architect, Ms. Ellis. She was a sharp-eyed woman with a commanding presence, her voice cutting through the room like a blade. "You're here because we saw potential in your applications," she said, pacing in front of the group. "But potential isn't enough. Over the next 8 weeks, you'll be tested. We'll see who has the skill, the determination, and the grit to succeed in this field." Carl swallowed hard. The stakes were clear, and he was ready to rise to the challenge. The first few days were overwhelming. Carl was assigned to shadow a junior architect named Brian, who guided him through the basics of the firm's design processes. Carl spent hours studying blueprints, learning to use advanced software, and observing client meetings. "Don't be afraid to ask questions," Brian said one afternoon as they reviewed a project. "This is how you learn." Carl nodded, taking notes furiously. Despite the steep learning curve, he found himself fascinated by the work. Every detail, from the angle of a roof to the placement of a window, told a story. It was like bringing his sketches to life on a grander scale. 1 week into the internship, Ms. Ellis announced a competition among the interns. Each participant would design a conceptual project based on the theme of reimagining public spaces. The winner would present their design to the firm's partners, with the possibility of securing a long-term mentorship. Carl's mind raced with ideas as soon as he heard the challenge. He thought about his community, the neglected parks, crumbling playgrounds, and abandoned lots. What if he could turn those forgotten spaces into vibrant, welcoming places for people to gather? What if he could create something that truly mattered? Carl threw himself into the project with everything he had. He spent late nights sketching and researching, poring over case studies of urban renewal projects. His concept was ambitious: a multi-use public space that blended art, recreation, and environmental sustainability. The design featured a central plaza with rotating art installations, a rainwater-fed garden, and shaded seating areas designed to encourage community interaction. The work was exhausting but exhilarating. Carl's vision consumed him, and the lines between his internship, the scholarship program, and his personal passion blurred. He knew he was pushing himself to the limit, but he couldn't stop, not when this project felt like the culmination of everything he'd worked toward. One afternoon, as Carl was fine-tuning his design, Ms. Ellis stopped by his workstation. She glanced at his sketches, her sharp gaze scanning every detail. "This is bold," she said after a moment, her tone neutral. Carl's heart pounded. Is that a good thing? Ms. Ellis raised an eyebrow. Bold can be good, but it can also be risky. Your concept has potential, but it needs refinement. Think about how the space will function day to day, not just how it looks on paper. Carl nodded, taking her advice to heart. He spent the next several days revising his design, adding practical elements like clear signage, accessible pathways, and multipurpose spaces that could adapt to different community needs. The day of the competition arrived, and Carl stood in the conference room with the other interns, his model and presentation materials spread out on a table. His palms were sweaty, but he reminded himself of Lisa's words. "You've worked hard for this. You've earned it." When it was his turn to present, Carl took a deep breath and stepped forward. He started by explaining the inspiration behind his project, the need for inclusive, sustainable spaces that brought communities together. He walked the judges through his design, highlighting the features he carefully planned to make the space functional and welcoming. As he spoke, he felt his confidence grow. This wasn't just a project. It was a reflection of his vision, his values, and his dreams. When he finished, there was a moment of silence before Ms. Ellis spoke. "Your passion for this project is evident, Carl. It's a thoughtful design with a strong focus on community. Well done." The judges nodded in agreement, and Carl felt a wave of relief and pride wash over him. The results were announced later that day, and Carl's name was called as the winner. He could hardly believe it as he walked to the front of the room to accept the recognition. The applause felt surreal, but the most meaningful moment came when Ms. Ellis handed him a certificate and said, "You've earned this. Keep pushing yourself, Carl. You have the potential to do great things." That evening, Carl returned home to find Lisa waiting for him on the porch. She stood up as soon as she saw him, her face lighting up with a smile. "How'd it go?" she asked, her voice filled with anticipation. Carl held up the certificate, grinning. "I won." Lisa let out a laugh of pure joy and pulled him into a tight hug. "I'm so proud of you, Carl. You've worked so hard for this, and you deserve every bit of it." They sat on the porch together, talking about the competition and Carl's plans for the future. For the first time, Carl felt like he wasn't just dreaming. He was living his dream, one step at a time. As the summer drew to a close, Carl reflected on everything he'd accomplished. The internship had been a challenge, but it had also been transformative. He gained skills, confidence, and a clearer sense of purpose. One evening, as Carl sat under the oak tree in the backyard, he opened his sketchbook and began to draw. This time, it wasn't just a house or a community center. It was a blueprint for the life he wanted to build, a life filled with purpose, passion, and the unwavering belief that anything was possible. He smiled as he added the finishing touches, the stars twinkling above him. The future was still uncertain, but Carl knew one thing for sure. He was ready for whatever came next, because he wasn't just building structures, he was building a legacy.